Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marine Biologist Deep Dive. My name is Guy Baker, and I am the editor of the Marine Biologist magazine. So what is the Deep Dive? Well, if it's your first experience, it's a live online conversation that builds on the content of the Marine Biologist, which is the Marine Biological Association's membership magazine. Each quarter, we choose an article from the magazine, and we invite the author to join us and go a bit deeper into the topic to really get our teeth into it, a little bit like a pajama shark chewing an octopus. So this morning, we will be discussing global shark hangouts with Professor David Sims, also the industrialized fishing that's going on and bringing in some aspects of climate change. And this is inspired by Professor Sims' article in the most recent January edition of the Marine Biologist magazine. And it promises to be a fascinating discussion. So welcome everybody. But before we dive in, I'd like to introduce David properly. So David is a senior research fellow at the Marine Biological Association, and he's also a professor of marine ecology at the University of Southampton's National Oceanography Centre. He leads the Sims Lab, which is the Movement, Ecology and Conservation of Marine Predators Research Group at the MBA's laboratory in Plymouth. And his research focuses on the movement, ecology and conservation of marine predators, in particular sharks, skates and rays. So thank you, David, welcome. And thank you everybody for joining us. It's great to have you all tuning in. David, could you tell us what first inspired you to be a marine biologist?
Oh, well, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Well, that's easy, really. I was born and grew up by the sea. I mean, literally right by it. And I was very lucky that I had parents who encouraged me to go onto the beach and to look at all the amazing life that you could see just in the rock pools and so on. But then as I got older, I went more on the water and then ultimately under it as well. And really, that's what captured, my fascination with the animals there, and to try and understand what it was they were doing. I think that was my main curiosity.
Fantastic. And why did you specialize as you did? I mean, your field now is behavioral ecology of marine predators. So why did you end up there, and why have sharks become such a big feature in your research?
Yeah, it's interesting here. How do you end up where you do? For me, I not only was I fascinated with the sea and everything to do with marine from a very early age, I also became fascinated by sharks. Mainly, I think, because in the early 1970s, I'm showing my age now, aren't I? When I was a little kid, there were these amazing programs on a Sunday evening, Jacques Cousteau's Undersea World. And obviously, Jacques Cousteau was very interested in sharks, and they did a lot of sort of shark chasing and so on. And that really sort of captured my imagination, I think. And the years sort of since then to when I was doing sort of, exams to go into university, I was still hearing the words, the ideas that, well, actually, we don't know much about these animals. And I thought, well, that's amazing. I mean, they're big, they seem to be, observable. You can go to reefs and see them. Why is it we don't know too much about them? And I guess then when I was at university, something happened there that really started me on that route for sure. And that was when I was diving, and just by chance, a huge basking shark swam past. And I stayed with it for a few minutes, and then it was gone. And I just remember it now, its tail, a caudal fin flapping around, just going off into the gloom. And I just thought, well, where's it going? What's it doing? And I think that was the thing that really set me on the path to try and sort of discover some of these unknowns, these big knowledge gaps. And that's where that was 30 years ago. And here I am still doing it and trying to understand them.
Fantastic. So let's move over to your article. Early on in the article, you say that a Mako shark that you were tracking crossed the Atlantic, and that opened your eyes to hidden shark behavior. Can you tell us a bit more about that that moment?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it stems from what I was just saying about suddenly you see sharks and then they're gone. What is it? You know, where do they go, and what is it they might be doing, and also why might they be doing it? And so Mako sharks obviously are the world's fastest shark. They can clock sort of speeds of sort of 40 miles an hour when pursuing prey and chasing down prey. But actually, just like the basking shark, not much was known about them. And obviously, to study something like that can move, you know, 70 odd kilometers a day, you really need this new technology. And I know we'll come on to that. But that little shark, but it was about 1.5 meters long, and it was tagged in the western part of the North Atlantic. And up to that point, no Mako shark had ever been tracked making a transatlantic journey. There had been some sharks, Mako sharks, that had been marked with number tags. And some of those had turned up in the eastern part of the Atlantic, but no one had ever tracked Makos. And it was unknown what sort of, you know, time it would take them to do it. Did it take years for them to get that far in sort of moving around, or did they just zoom over there quickly? That little shark opened us up to a few things, which was, firstly, it made a transatlantic journey in just a few weeks, really. And the other thing was that it did some incredible dives as well. So it wasn't just the horizontal behavior that was fascinating. It was doing these incredible dives down to, amazingly, down to 1.7 kilometers down. And that, you know, below 1,000 meters, it's completely dark. I mean, it's called the midnight zone for a reason. So we thought, what was that little shark doing, making a transatlantic journey, but also going down so deep? And I think that's when we realized, and Makos had never been tracked going that deep before, but there again, no one had tagged them in the mid-Atlantic over water that was about 5,000 meters deep. So it opened our eyes to the idea that, oh, hold on a minute, there could be unknown hidden behaviors going on here with these fascinating creatures. And so we really stepped up our efforts to try and deploy tags in these far-flung sort of oceanic areas of the Atlantic.
Incredible that what technology is allowing, and that's really something that comes through strongly in your article. What science questions has this technology enabled, and what would your research look like without the tracking technology that features in the article?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, would we have discovered so much without the technology? Well, of course, the answer is no. As I mentioned a couple of times before, I guess it's a recurring theme in what I'm saying, is that without this amazing technology, I've got some tags here actually. This is a pop-up satellite transmitter that we put on sharks. It pops off and then signals to satellites. And there's another one that you can fit to the dorsal fin that when it breaks the surface. Without this kind of technology, we would just be looking at the disappearing caudal fin of that basking shark again. We'd be looking at a fleeting sort of a dorsal fin. So our research in terms of shark behavior probably wouldn't exist. You know, the observations we make would be limited to, for example, fishery data, where sharks are occurring when they're caught by the fishery. And of course, that's a little bit different to what habitats the sharks might be choosing themselves. The fishers might go to certain places to catch tunas and swordfish and come across sharks and catch those and retain them and land them and sell them and so on. But it could be that the sharks are actually hanging out in other locations that aren't overlapping with fishers. So the technology's really given us a view on that window. It's really sort of pulled up the blinds, enabled us to peer through, because without it, we'd be following them in boats, or trying to anyway. And we started doing that. I mean, when I first started working on basking sharks, sort of soon after I was a graduate student, we were following them in boats and taking plankton samples. We didn't have the technology when we first started in the mid-1990s. And luckily, basking sharks do spend a lot of time at the surface. But of course, Mako sharks and other sharks we've worked on, blue sharks, for example, you wouldn't be able to study them in that way. And so the technology really has enabled a whole field, and it's not just in sharks, it's in all sorts of marine animals, from turtles to seals to the great whales as well, baleen whales, blue whales. It's really, the field is called biologging, and it really is a vibrant, burgeoning field. And I feel sure that it's going to have a big role to play in the UN Decade of the Ocean, which I know you're interested in asking me about.
Yes, because that was the theme of the January edition, so we touched on that quite a lot. Yes, it's incredible that these insights into individual animals and what they're doing, and I guess there'll also be all sorts of unexpected spin-offs and information that scientists find out that perhaps they weren't looking for directly anyway. So moving on a bit, your article shows that industrial fishing is not the only threat to these open ocean sharks. Can you expand on that a bit, David?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the article, I talked about industrialized fishing, and what I mean by industrialized fishing is these very large vessels, tens of meters long, necessarily, tens of tons in weight, that go off into the ocean for weeks, maybe months at a time. On a single trip. And it's those vessels and longliners in particular. So these are these baited longlines. Each longline that's deployed per day by a vessel will be about 100 kilometers long, with about 1,200 baited hooks. And so these vessels, they're able to go to places that 50 years ago, they wouldn't have been able to go to. And so sharks really, in some respects, had a refuge from that sort of, intense, large-scale fishing by being in the open ocean, far from land. But of course, those vessels are able to get there now, and so those hotspots of sharks, where the sharks like to spend most of their time, are now open to be exploited. And so the industrialized fishing, as I mentioned in the article, is a real problem. We found out that from tracking the sharks and also tracking global fleets of these longline vessels and other sorts of fishing vessels, that there was about a 24% overlap per month between the shark space use, the shark hotspots, and where there's high levels of fishing effort. And so that can be even higher. So for blue sharks, which are commercially important, the fins are incredibly important to the Far East market for shark fins. That can be up to 76% spatial overlap. So where the sharks are hanging out, that's where the vessels are hanging out too. Your question relates to what other sort of threats are there. And of course, one of the principal things that remains actually relatively unstudied so far is the impact of climate change on these oceanic sharks. And we know very little actually at this present time. There are so many knowledge gaps. There's so much opportunity for research and to discover new things. One of the areas we've tried to investigate are the effects of ocean deoxygenation. And so in the article, I talk about how the oceans are losing oxygen. And this is a consequence of climate change. And climate change is acting directly and indirectly to drive down levels of oxygen. Why is that important for sharks? Well, think of our Mako shark. It's fast swimming, it's warm bodied, its temperature of its body can be sort of, anything up to sort of 10 degrees above ambient sea temperature. And so they're very active predators with a high oxygen demand. And so it's likely that in these areas where oxygen is decreasing, and in fact, there are already permanent oxygen minimum zones in the ocean, sharks are going to be affected by the size of these sorts of hypoxic habitats. And so our question that we've asked fairly recently in our research is, to what degree is fishing and climate change, the ocean deoxygenation, interacting to make sharks more vulnerable to fishing? And the article spells out some of our early results. We've just had a paper published in the journal eLife, actually, which sets out how blue sharks are affected by these oxygen minimum zones. And oxygen minimum zones, because of climate change and the drop in ocean oxygen, these zones are actually expanding. Imagine a sort of a ball of low oxygen water, and that sort of expanding up, being pumped up, it's sort of growing. And so the question is that compressing sharks closer to the surface, where they might be more vulnerable to these surface longline fisheries? And our conclusion in this first bit of research that's published recently is that that seems to be the case. There is habitat compression, and catches are, not only is fishing effort higher over the top of these oxygen minimum zones, but also the catches of blue sharks in this particular study of ours was higher too. So it looks like the sharks are being aggregated to some degree by these sharp DO gradients and are compressed into sort of, if you like, shallower water above them. So I think the impact of climate change interacting with fisheries is a really key area that we need to try to investigate and understand better than we have to up to now. I think you're muted, Guy.
Unmute myself, thank you. There's a bit of coughing going on there, so I spared you all that. Thank you, Dave. It's fascinating. Just before I ask another question, I'd really like to encourage everyone who's listening in to raise a hand if they've got a question, or type it into the Q&A box. We have a comment that came early from Marcel Chorowski, who said, I think it was when you said you saw a basking shark when you were diving, he said maybe the basking shark was running away from something. So perhaps that was you, David. Maybe you scared it away.
I don't know. I'm going to respond to that by saying it was coming towards me. It was feeding in a plankton patch, and I was at the surface actually, and I saw the fin, and it was feeding. It was sort of zigzagging along, meandering through the patch. So I don't think I was affecting it at all. It didn't seem interested in me whatsoever, which I was a bit miffed about at the time. You know.
We have a question that's come in from Colin Williams. I'll read it out. Since blue sharks spend most of their time in surface waters, even outside of the oxygen minimum zone, then how important is their sporadic deep diving behavior from a biological perspective? He goes on to say, is ocean deoxygenation a greater threat to species such as big-eyed tuna and thresher sharks that spend more time below the mixed layer?
Yeah, so blue sharks do spend a lot of time in the surface layers. You know, most of their time is in the top 250 meters of water. But they do undertake on a daily basis dives down to 400, 800, and as we found, over 1,000 meters. And they'll do this in normally oxygenated water columns. The frequency of the diving is usually daily for that. And they're usually diving deep during the day as well. And this gives us the idea that they're trying to detect and locate, stay with prey organisms such as fishes and cephalopods, squids, for example, that might be associated with sort of deep scattering layers. And so what we find when they go into waters that are being affected by low oxygen, so hypoxic water at depth, is that the frequency of those deep dives decreases, and obviously the average maximum dive depth gets shallower. So they're still spending their time at the surface because these oxygen minimum zones tend to go from about sort of 200 to 800 meters deep. There's sort of a ball of hypoxia at that sort of mesopelagic depth, and the blue sharks their behavior is responding to that hypoxia. Is it important? I think it is, because of that interaction with fisheries. Fisheries, when you look at maps, I'd encourage people to find the eLife paper. If you go to just type in eLife, it'll get you to the journal, and our paper is sort of one of the more recent ones published. If you look at some of the maps in there, and I think there may be some in the article actually, there's a map in the article that shows these hotspots of fishing along these oxygen minimum zones, above these oxygen minimum zones. They're very important actually commercially. And that's not just for blue shark, they're also important for tuna. So the second part of Colin's question relates to, big eye threshers, which are obviously sharks, which are prohibited to catch. They're a protected species in the Atlantic, the whole Atlantic. But they are still being caught as bycatch, of course, and dying on these long lines. And it looks like from the early data we have from the fishery that, in fact, big eye threshers as well as tuners are also being caught in higher numbers above these oxygen minimum zones. So I think it's not just a species. I think it's an assemblage of predators that are being affected. The question about, well, is it important from a population perspective? Obviously, blue sharks range across the whole Atlantic, actually. However, we do know that their populations are declining. That Atlantic population is declining. And so these hotspot areas where they spend most time are going to become more important as the species, as that population becomes more exploited. And especially it's problematic if those hotspots are being exploited more than they were in the past. I think that's where we need to be really cautious and careful and look out for where the fishing is happening. Not just that fishing is happening, but where it's happening. And I'll come back to that idea of spatial awareness, spatial management of shark hotspots in relation to fishing.
Thank you, David. I'd encourage people to keep asking questions. Here we go. I think we have another one in from Liberty. Liberty asks, do you think further looking at the impact of interacting fisheries and climate change in different species could be a plausible master's project?
Yeah, one thing I would say is that a master's project usually lasts for about sort of maximum of 6 to 9 months. And I don't want to scare anyone off, but that study I just mentioned that we published in eLife has taken us the best part of 7 years. So I think if the data's been collected already and it's available for a desk-based analysis, then certainly it's amenable to master's projects. And certainly we do have Masters of Research students working with us on this. We've through our lab, I guess, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've had about 30 different master's students working on the shark behavior in relation to the environment and fisheries. So there are real opportunities, but the key thing is to have that data collected. And luckily, we have very active research programs that are collecting data all the time. In fact, I was just checking on my computer earlier. We're tracking 2 Mako sharks just around the Azores in the center of the Atlantic, and a few blue sharks as well that have just moved down off West Africa to the oxygen minimum zone there. So we're collecting this data via satellite all the time. And hopefully that, what we want to do is obviously in our research group is build a buoyant group of people who are passionate about discovering new things about sharks and ways in which we can inform their conservation, because I'm sure everyone listening knows that just in the last few weeks, a landmark study came out demonstrating that 70% of oceanic shark populations, there's a 70% decline over the last 50 years. So they have got problems. They are being impacted by overfishing, and our research actually hopefully informs that management, that conservation process.
Well, thank you. That leads me on to another question I had, which is what would your vision be of how the world would be different as a result of your research?
Yeah, it's important, isn't it, that the research we're doing, I mean, we started off by asking fundamental questions, didn't we? I mentioned these right at the start of the Q&A. What are the sharks doing? Where are they going? Why are they doing it? And obviously, through us asking those sort of fundamental questions to try and reveal aspects of their behavior and ecology, we've discovered things which are very relevant to their conservation and management. And in the article, hopefully I spell out that these sort of global shark hangouts are crucial areas where sharks of different species aggregate, and that's due to their interaction with the environment. There's appropriate habitat there for their prey species to live their lives and do what they do, and the sharks are responding to those prey gradients and remaining in certain areas, not just for feeding but also for reproduction. So where they spend most of the time are crucial areas. And I think that's where the satellite tracking has really come into its own, especially when you start to scale up what you're doing. 1 or 2 tags like these here might give us an interesting bit of behavior, but it won't necessarily give us a sort of a global, a population-wide sort of picture as to what's going on. And over the years, what we've been able to do is not only through our own work, but also by collaborating with colleagues, is to build up this global data set. And I mention in the article about the Global Shark Movement Project, which started sort of 5 years ago. And it now consists of about 150 scientists across 26 countries. And we've pooled the data into a central database, and we can really start to properly address this question of where are the sharks hanging out? What are the habitats like where they hang out? Are they prey rich? Are they prey poor? What's the temperature gradients there? What are the things that are attracting them to those areas? And can we predict where these hangouts will be? Most recently, obviously, we've looked at the overlap with fisheries. And I think, to answer your question directly, Guy, I think where our research really fits in is to understand where the sharks are. And that's something in fisheries assessments that's actually very poorly understood. Generally, a lot of fisheries assessments are based on time series data. So it's a temporal type analysis of what happens through time to that population, those different cohorts that are appearing in that population of juveniles and subadults and adults. I think where the satellite tracking can come in is to actually give a fisheries independent view of the habitats that sharks prefer, and us trying to incorporate that spatial dynamic into these fisheries assessments is one of the things that we're really trying to do at the moment. And I think that's where it can be most useful to aid conservation, is to understand where the sharks are in relation to the fishes. And then also to think about, well, is it appropriate to have time area closures, for example, at certain times of the year when sharks are most aggregated in these areas, and actually delimit any sort of fishing that's going on. That's not to say that spatial management is the only thing that one needs to do. That's not the case. Clearly, the existing management regimes, the existing assessments are absolutely crucial to understand the status of the population. That's something that the satellite tracking finds hard to do. But what we can do is understand that spatial dynamic. And I think we've got to try and incorporate that into those assessments. I think that's where it'll be most useful for conservation.
Yeah, I guess it's difficult to visualize for creatures of the land like us what a habitat is when it doesn't, I don't know about other people, maybe it's different for fishers and people whose minds are constantly in the open ocean, but a habitat is a seabed, and to change your thinking to say that a habitat is an area in the open sea, maybe a mile from the seabed, maybe 1,000 miles from land, it's a completely different sort of imagination, a different way of thinking.
I think you're right, and I think that's why you're exactly right. We have trouble with it, don't we? Because we can't put necessarily a physical boundary to it. A coral reef, we understand it's there, we can see it, and we can see what's happening to it, and if that's problematic, we can put in place management measures that might, change the practices that go on there. In the open ocean, in a 3-dimensional cube of water, what do we do? But the sharks know where the habitat is, of course. And what we're talking about really, when we talk about oceanic habitat, are these boundaries between different water masses with different characteristics. It might be temperature, it might be particles of plankton and so on. And it's those understanding those sorts of habitats that we can't readily see, but are important to the sharks for foraging and meeting up with others for reproduction and so on. That's absolutely crucial to understand. And I think that we have got to get a better sort of feeling for and the data on what these habitats represent to the shark before we can start to think, well, actually, can we manage that three-dimensional cube of seawater? So yeah, it's a very relevant question and difficult for us. I think we have struggled.
Great. I'd like to remind participants you can use the raise your hand function in Zoom and chip in. We can activate your microphone and you can ask your question directly to David. So I would encourage people to do that. In the meantime, I've got another question I had. We focused on the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development in the January edition. Do you think this is important, the UN Decade, and how will your research contribute towards its aims?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that here we have a real opportunity with the UN Decade of the Ocean. It's an opportunity because it puts a spotlight on the ocean. There are obviously multiple spotlights on the ocean for various things, whether it be climate change or pollution. But here we have an opportunity to spotlight the ocean and draw people's attention to it in its entirety. So there will be, I imagine, there will be UN decade programs on all sorts of things, from oceanography to particular zones in the ocean, to, I hope, biologging of marine predators. And I think for our own work, we hope to contribute to hopefully several programs. And I think that the good thing about contributing to a program is the program is big. It pulls in lots of different research groups with different expertise, and we can start to work together to pool data, to ask questions we couldn't before. Just like my example of the Global Shark Movement Project. When we were working just in our own research team, we couldn't ask those questions that we could when we all worked together as a community, as a scientific community. And I think there is a greater willingness to share data, to be transparent about our data and our research and what we're doing, and to work together. And that's certainly something that I think the shark tracking scientific community have been early to embrace. And I think the UN Decade just builds on that. It builds on this idea of working together to address strategic and important issues about the conservation of our ocean. And I fully expect there to be rounded programs that cover everything from, oceanography and geophysics right through to the behavior of sharks and whales. So I'm really looking forward to it, actually.
Great. And one of the things that came through when we were putting together that edition was that the UN Decade is very much aimed at society and young people and inclusivity. So I would encourage younger members who are tuning in today to keep up with what's going on with the Ocean Decade. Do feel free to get in touch with myself or other people at the Marine Biological Association, because there are ways to get involved. There's things like ocean literacy and being a member of the Marine Biological Association, of course. So yeah, it's supposed to penetrate all parts of society and be inclusive. So we have another question from Colin going to the Q&A. What are the current limitations to deploying satellite tags with oxygen sensors?
Well, the current limitation is there isn't one. So that's a major limitation. We actually, well, I mention it in the article, but for those who haven't seen that, I work, excuse me, I work with a team at the University of Porto led by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Nuno Queiroz. And his team have developed an archival dissolved oxygen sensing tag that also have swimming depth sensors, temperature sensors, but also accelerometers for detecting the movements of the sharks as they swim. So you can actually detect the tail beats and the speed of the shark as well as it moves through the water. So this phenomenally smart little tag that can be fitted onto the fin that measures not only oxygen, but these other things as well. So we'll get an unparalleled view of how sharks behaviorally are responding to lower oxygen when we deploy them, well, hopefully this year in that oxygen minimum zone off West Africa from the Cape Verde Islands. Colin's question about satellite tags, I mean, this is an archival tag that then pops off and relays the data via satellite. And this is one that relays position directly via satellite or is detected by satellite. What we are aiming to do, and I spoke with Nuno actually just the other day, and his team are really keen to develop a tag that can relay dissolved oxygen data via satellite. And this will enable us, just like in our recent Nature paper of a year or so ago that looked at the global movements of 23 species of pelagic shark, what that sort of look will do if we can get a tag that can be deployed on sharks for much, much longer. The archival tag at the moment only has a deployment of about 3 days, and we need to retrieve it to get the data back. But if we can develop a satellite based system, then we can deploy it much more broadly across the world's oceans. And those tags can potentially go last much, much longer. So for example, those sharks I mentioned we were tracking, those Mako sharks, those have been tracked since July of last year. So we can get, sort of hopefully up to a year or even 2 years. Some of our tracks are 2 or 3 years long. And that's what we'd like, is to look at the long-term movements of sharks and interaction with these oxygen minimum zones, because it's likely, it seems from our data, that sharks like blue sharks appear attracted to these oxygen minimum zone areas, because as we found with them, they're compressed into that top layer. But of course, so are their prey species as well. They might be hypoxia intolerant. And so these actually might be sort of feeding hotspots, foraging hotspots for sharks. So we really want to understand the long-term movements of sharks in relation to those oxygen minimum zones, because it's a double whammy, really. If the shark is being attracted to those areas for foraging, and so are the fishers, because they know that in the past they've caught good amounts of tuna and sharks there, then we've got this sort of spiraling effect of leading to overfishing, which is a problem.
I was wondering, there's these citizen science projects which are coming up with various ways of handling large amounts of data. Can you ever see a sort of scenario where there'll be so many sharks tracked and so much data that you can throw it open to people who are insomniacs who want to sit up at night tracking where a Mako shark is or something like that?
I guess there's that possibility, isn't there? I'd imagine if it were to go down that route, we'd obviously have to be tracking a lot of sharks sort of in near real time. And I guess that's one of our limitations at the moment, is we can't get to the population level at any one time. So for example, that recent study that I mentioned in Nature just a year or so ago, that tracked nearly 2,000 sharks, but not all at the same time. What we're hoping for as part of Ocean Decade and a new project that we have starting here, funded by the European Research Council, is to actually track tens, hundreds of sharks at the same time. And so if we get into that territory, then there is this opportunity that suddenly we're getting more data than the scientists can handle. And then what we might do is to actually say, well, look, if anyone's interested, can they look at individual tracks and find out something interesting? So in other words, the shark goes straight for a while, but then it stops and it meanders around and stays in a particular area. Well, where are those areas? What are those patterns? I could easily see how that could become an interesting sort of citizen science project. You know, can you unravel the shark ball of string to figure out what they're doing? You know, that kind of thing. That would be a lot of fun, I reckon.
I'm sure there'd be a lot of take up for that. We have a question from Rebecca Irvin. She says, you spoke about looking at the shark's habitat as a 3D cube. How important is physical and biological oceanography to your work? What sort of sources do you use, and how do you incorporate that into looking at shark distribution and movement?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. Yeah, biological oceanography is crucial to our work, actually, because we're tracking the shark and it has a tag on it that can measure temperature of the water, for example, or our most recent one I mentioned was dissolved oxygen. So we can record what the environment is, at least in some respects, around the shark. What is the shark experiencing? But what we won't know from our tagging is what was available to the shark. Generally, so we need to be able to figure out, well, what is it that the shark chose to do? What did it prefer versus what was available? And that takes us down the route of doing lots of our sort of fun sort of randomization type analyses to look at sort of habitat selection and so on. But biological oceanography is super important to us, and we use satellite remote sensing imagery for that. And we use probably about 20 different parameters, from sea surface temperature to temperature at depth. And obviously a lot of these subsurface products are modeled. So they're informed by observations that have been made, but they are modeled products. And that's true for dissolved oxygen at the moment. The three-dimensional sort of dissolved oxygen data that we're using, that is freely available. You know, you can download it from these really awesome oceanography product sort of websites. That's modeled oxygen. It could be that we're analyzing sharks in relation to that, in that context of the environment. But actually that might not be what they're experiencing, because of course in a modeled product, there's lots of, there's interpolation, there might be missing values. And so we're always looking for new and better sort of oceanography, better products that tell us in more detail what the environment looks like that the shark is actually experiencing. So I guess we couldn't do what we do in terms of our analyses of looking at habitat selection, running our generalized additive models of what variables are important to describe shark density, for example, shark location density. We couldn't do all that without these oceanographic, excuse me, this oceanographic products that are available. So yeah, biology and physics is really important to shark behavior.
David, I think we have a hand up. Maya, do you have a question?
Hi there, yeah, it's Maya here. For those of you who don't know, I'm head of comms here at the MBA. And I just had a question for you, David, but it's also a very unsubtle promotion of an event that's upcoming that you're involved in. Education and impact of all of this amazing research that you're doing is obviously really important. And part of the way that we're going to promote some of the research that you're doing is through our YMB Young Marine Biologist membership event, which is sponsored by Save Our Seas Foundation, which is running in November. There'll be lots more information on that coming through for people through their membership bulletins and websites and social media. So do check into that, and we're looking forward to David being part of that event on ocean predators, so very relevant theme. So can you tell me a little bit more about what other elements of education or outreach that you've got linked to this project?
The project that's is just starting on ocean deoxygenation, fisheries and shark behavior. We hope to have, I mean, it's still in its early, excuse me, early stages, and we hope to have all sorts of things available. But one of the, I think one of the things I'm most excited about is a tag that we have developed, which has a small video camera on it, a video logger. It's about 4 centimeters long, this video logger. And it fits into the tag that can be taken down to about 1,000 meters by these sharks. And so what I personally am very interested to see will be what the sharks are finding down there. What are they actually doing at 1,000 meters depth? Not just in the oxygen minimum zones. The blue sharks certainly go into those low oxygen waters. Firstly, how are they doing that? How are they holding their breath, for example? How might they be doing it? but also what prey are they encountering there? And I think when we start to get that video data back, that is a super opportunity to get people involved. Because one thing I've learned with working with video and shark behavior is that you get, every frame is a slice of data, and you've got to look at every frame so you don't miss anything. So this logger is going to be going at sort of, anything up to sort of, 10, 20 frames a second at times. We are going to have a lot of frames of data to look at. And it strikes me that in addition to what I was talking to Guy about, that would be a great opportunity to get more people involved. What can you spot on this video frame that is pointing forward in the direction that the shark is swimming? Can you count the bioluminescence on there? Or rather, please do count the bioluminescence on there, which will really help us out. So I'd like to think we'll have really good sort of video data coming out, which obviously we'd like to make public as soon as possible to give people a fantastic view of what's going on down there. So I think the video will be a really great thing to start with anyway.
Thank you, David. I have another question from Marcel, who says, do you think sharks which were thought to be extinct are hiding in places where humans haven't ever discovered, like trenches?
Yeah, I mean, it's very tantalizing, isn't it? We're always amazed when new species pop up that haven't been seen before, and this is still very common for terrestrial mammals. I mean, they're still there, and whales as well. New species of whales that kind of look like other ones. I think there was one just a few weeks ago. So are there sharks? I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, don't forget that the megamouth shark was unknown to science till the 1980s, the mid-1980s. For sure, it had been seen by fishers in those areas where they occur, years before that. But it had never been brought to the attention, so it could be described in a scientific way. And so, yes, if they are out there, they're going to be in places that we don't normally visit, that we don't visit very often. And so it'd be nice to think there are things like megamouth, things that are undiscovered still there. But of course, the more that we invest in things like Ocean Decade, we explore the oceans more, the chances of finding the amazing new species are, of course, much, much greater. And I personally look forward to it.
Fantastic. Another question from Rebecca Irvin. You mentioned a more citizen science approach. Well, we were talking about that. Sensitive species are often either removed or shown in publicly available data at a lower resolution. Many of the species you mentioned are vulnerable in some way. How will this be considered and dealt with if tracks are made publicly available?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we get asked that a lot, actually. I get emails and questions when I give talks, not only public talks, but at conferences too. Isn't your data helping, fishers find the fish? And isn't this contributing to the exploitation? I mean, obviously we don't make sensitive data available. And that's something obviously to consider. So for the species that are necessarily endangered or threatened, we don't make raw data available. And that would be the case in citizen science as well, that you wouldn't necessarily make the raw data available. From that raw data, you always have to derive data so it's in a form that you can start to look at it and start to analyze it. And that wouldn't be different. The idea that we're informing fishers on where to find the fish, actually, these longliners, for example, don't need our help to find out where the sharks are, because largely we're finding that where there are hangouts of sharks, the most important hangouts of sharks are already known to the fishers. They already overlap those areas. I mean, 81% of sort of shark hotspots are overlapped by some level of fishing effort. So the fishers already know where the fish are, and this is built on their experience. These longline fishers going into the open ocean, for example, have been doing it a long time. Often it's handed down from within a sort of family. So there's a lot of cultural knowledge there and experience. And also now with technology, the fishers are much better informed than they used to be. So, for example, some of them purchase sea surface temperature satellite images in near real time. So when they're out there in the ocean, they can see where the fronts are, these boundaries that I mentioned between different water masses, different temperatures. And sharks, like blue sharks and Mako sharks, do like to orientate to these frontal systems. And that can obviously lead the fishers to enhance their catches. And so they already know where the fishes are. We're not really telling them anything they don't. What we're trying to do is to get information where we can analyze where they're occurring in relation to the shark. Yes, if we identify that there's a refuge that isn't covered, that isn't overlapped, then clearly that's some sort of refuge for threatened species that does become more important. But we still have the challenge of how does even when that's identified, how does one protect that? And in the high seas, that's proving to be a very difficult prospect.
It's a huge subject. I've got one. If anyone else has got any questions, please do chip in, put your hand up, or type them into the Q&A. We have 5 or so minutes left, so I'll throw one at you, David, at a slightly different angle. I've got a question. Most young people will be using social media as they develop their careers. What are the positive and negative aspects of social media for your research?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? The positive effects, of course, of social media, and I've been a Twitter user for only about sort of 5 years, really. When I saw the power of it at a conference that I ran on shark behavior, biology and conservation, the power of getting stories out there, messages out there to people, enabling them to find out about research and the results of research and how researchers do things in terms of shark research, almost immediately that it happens, informing people about the results of research papers that otherwise might go missed by people. It's a great way, of course, of disseminating information. But I guess the downside of it, as well as it being absolutely fantastic, is that there's the chance that you convey complex science and economic and perhaps political issues when it comes to fishing in soundbite biology. And obviously the real world's very complex and does require that we analyze data and the consequences of new results from different directions. And I think sometimes social media can miss, because it's 180 characters, or well, it used to be, I don't know what it is now, but there's the chance that some of the deeper thinking, the deeper analyses can get missed by people, and there is that opportunity for misunderstanding. And I think we've just got to be careful about that. How we actually communicate some of the more complex issues that have effects on people. So if we're talking about closing areas to fishing, that has a consequence for the fishers and their families and the economy of particular areas. And we've got to carefully consider that. So I think that for me, the positive is, I think at the moment outweighs the negative, at least from a shark perspective. I think giving people, a new view on how we go about understanding shark behavior. I think it's been a power for good, I think, so far.
Great, thank you. Well, we've got another question in the chat, and we might have time for one more after this. So I'll throw this one at you, David. Liberty asks, I'm aware there's been a lot of thought behind potential issues with use. But have you ever used, or do you have any interest in using internal tags to hopefully get a longer lifespan from the tag and so more long-term data from each shark?
Yeah, internal tags have been around a long time, actually. And we have used them ourselves, mainly using acoustic tracking systems. So acoustic tracking systems are different to the satellite. Acoustic tracking systems, actually, it's a small transmitter that emits a sound pulse into the water. And of course, in water, sound travels very, very happily, and especially at certain wavelengths, certain frequencies. And so we've used it for long-term studies where you can put a small tag inside the body cavity of a shark, and then it doesn't have anything external to it that can either fall off or damage its fin or whatever. And then it will go off for many years. And in fact, we found that the behavior of those internally tagged sharks is no different to sharks that have been tagged externally. And in fact, the internal tagging that goes on, it's a very small incision in the body cavity. So I've been part of research that has tagged sort of 2-3 meter long lemon sharks, a very small incision. And the shark is put into the tonic immobile state, where it goes into this sort of a state where it's immobile and doesn't seem to respond. And the tag is, by trained researchers, is put into the body cavity and then sutured up. And it's actually a very effective method of long-term tracking that actually has no long-term effects on the health or behavior of the shark. In terms of satellite tracking, obviously these sorts of tags, these pop-ups, have got to pop up. So they're not internally, everything is external. But we put the connections that we put onto the shark actually will dissolve and drop away over time. So what we're always looking to try to do is to reduce any longer term effects on the shark. There are tags now which are sort of so-called lifetime tags, tags which are placed internally that will actually pop up when the animal dies and decomposes on the seafloor, and then the tag will then float to the surface. We've not used those ourselves, but they are out there, these ideas that you can get data over the lifetime of an animal. I mean, that even when it's popped up and is floating around, will store data on there for 20 years. And in fact, we've had tags come back to us about 14, 15 years later that people have found washed up on beaches, and they send it to us. Still got our address on it, and they send it, and we can still get the data from it. Yeah.
Amazing. We have one last question. From Marcel, if we could put Marcel on, if it could be a quick question, and then we'll round up. So go ahead, Marcel.
If you are like a fisherman, how much fishing would you like do? Like, as in, what I mean is that should we limit fishing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Should we limit fishing? And I think fishing is being limited for certain species in certain regions of the ocean, and that's necessary because the populations have declined. What we found with oceanic sharks, the ones I've been talking about, blue sharks and sort of Mako sharks and threshers, big eye threshers, is that the management has been slow to happen. And that's a problem because, as you know, sharks are long-lived, given the chance. They have slow growth, late maturity. They don't have many babies. So they are really sensitive to overfishing. That will drive population levels down, numbers down quite quickly. Management has not kept pace with the levels of exploitation. That's why we're seeing many oceanic sharks prohibited. So in the Atlantic, for example, it's prohibited to catch and land, kill and land silky sharks, big eye thresher sharks, oceanic white-tip sharks. But some of the most important, commercially important ones, like blue sharks and short fin Makos, the management's been very, very slow to respond to declines. And that's because sometimes the science can lag behind. You know, collecting the data and enough data takes time, and the models that are used to identify whether we should or shouldn't limit fishing often require you know, good amounts of different sorts of data, and those aren't always available. And so it hasn't always been possible to limit shark fishing at the right time. And so that's why we're seeing that, you know, for example, blue sharks have declined over the last 50 years by 40% globally, and even higher for some of the other more sensitive species. So there is a problem. Management has been a bit slow, but I remain optimistic that by having more science, doing more research, getting more dense data, more quality data, we've got the opportunity to, we're in a better position to know what's happening out there far from land, and be in a better position to conserve those shark populations. And there's no doubt that that's what they require at the moment. So yes, we should limit fishing, but then if fishing at a certain level is sustainable, in other words, the population is remaining at a sustainable level, at a number where it's able to replace itself, enough babies are produced that it replaces those being taken out, then where it's sustainable, it can exist into the future, then levels of fishing limits can be released. But we're not at that stage for the majority of these large sharks.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. I think we should probably round up now. That was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, David, and thank you all the participants. Thank you everyone for tuning
questions. Yeah, thank you.
Good, brilliant. So a great look into some Marine Biological Association research there. Thank you all members for tuning in. We will post this on YouTube quite soon, so please do send the link to your friends and families, get it widely seen. And also these Marine Biology Live events are happening every first and third Thursday of each month, so do tune in again. And I'd just like to say thank you all again. Thank you, David, and best wishes everybody, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.